Wyoming Territory, October 1886. In the middle of a roaring cattle auction, one woman stood alone, barometer in hand, eyes level on a yard full of men laughing at her. Freezing rain will be here before midnight. Move your cattle now. The biggest man in the crowd turned around slowly and laughed loud. Easy, meant to carry. She'll break before winter. She didn't say another word, just tightened her grip on the barometer and waited. 23 minutes later, the ice came down. Stay with me, because the winter of 1886 changed Drywater Basin forever, and it started right here. The cattle auction at Bitter Creek smelled the way it always did in late October: manure and sawdust, tobacco smoke and wet wool. The sharp bite of cold working its way under the barn doors. Men leaned against the rails and shouted bids across the yard. Breath rose in pale clouds above the pens. Tamsin Wren stood at the edge of the crowd with her barometer in her hands. She wasn't watching the cattle. She was watching the sky above the northern ridge. The pressure had been dropping since early morning. Steadily at first, then faster than she'd ever seen it fall in October. She'd checked the instrument 3 times in the last hour, hoping she'd made an error. She hadn't. She looked down at the water trough nearest the fence. A thin rim of ice had formed along the inside edge. It wasn't cold enough for that yet. Not by her thermometer. But the ice was there. The horses at the hitching posts were restless. Every one of them had turned its hindquarters toward the northern ridge and lowered its head. Steam from the cattle's breath was sinking instead of rising. Tamsin closed her hand around the barometer and pushed through toward the auctioneer's platform. "Excuse me," she said it twice before anyone moved. "I need a moment, please." The auctioneer, a heavy-set man with a red beard, looked down at her with the particular expression men used when they weren't sure whether to be annoyed or amused. He went with amused. "Something wrong with your bid, ma'am? There's a weather wall coming down from the north." She kept her voice level. "I've been reading the pressure since sunrise. It's collapsed faster than anything I've tracked in October. The freezing rain will be here before midnight, possibly sooner. Anyone with calves or weakened stock in open pens needs to move them under shelter now." The yard went quiet for about 2 seconds. Then it didn't. Laughter first. Then the low murmur of 24 conversations starting at once. A few men turned back to the pens without looking at her again. Several didn't bother turning away before they started talking. She heard the word hysterical. She heard outsider. She heard someone say she was probably looking for work and figured scaring people was a good way to find it. That last part was almost true, which didn't make it easier to stand there. A large man near the front rail turned around slowly. He had a broad, weathered face, the kind that had taken 30 years of wind without bothering to flinch. His coat was good quality. His boots were better. He looked at Tamsin the way a man looks at a fence post that's leaning in the wrong direction, more irritated than concerned. Amos Pike. She'd heard the name twice since arriving in Bitter Creek. He owned Pike Ridge Ranch and had a reputation for having survived more open winters than anyone in the basin. He looked her up and down. Then he laughed. It was a real laugh, full and easy, the kind meant to be heard. "She'll break before winter," he said. The men around him thought that was fine. Tamsin said nothing. She held the barometer steady and waited for the noise to settle. It was one of the men near the back who didn't laugh. He was standing with a small group of riders, leaning against the far pen rail with his arms crossed. Tall, lean, dark-coated. She hadn't noticed him before. He was watching her with an expression that was harder to read, not dismissive, not convinced either, just careful. He pushed off the rail and walked toward her. "What evidence," he said, "are you working from?" His voice was quiet, not gentle exactly, just precise. Tamsin held up the barometer. "This has dropped 4/10 of an inch in 2 hours. That rate in October means a classic pressure system, not a passing cold front." She nodded toward the trough. "Ice is forming at 51 degrees. The horses have turned their backs to the northern ridge. The steam off these cattle is sinking. She paused. Pick any two of those things. Together, they mean the same thing. The man looked at the trough. He looked at the horses. He didn't say anything for a moment. What needs to happen before nightfall, he asked. Before she could answer, a sound cut through the yard, a sharp metallic crack, then a low iron groan. The gate chain on the far pen had frozen through. It snapped clean. 40 cattle hit the open gap at once. They came through fast and wrong, the way frightened animals always moved, not a stampede yet, but close, building, the noise, and the pressure turning the animals behind them. The lane beyond the gate was crowded with wagons. There were families out there, children. Tamsin moved before she thought about it. She ran along the fence line toward the lane and looked at the lead animals. They were searching for an opening, heads swinging, finding the widest gap between the wagons. She knew which way they'd go. Canvas, she shouted toward the men, closest to the supply shed. Hang it along the left side of the lane now. Anything big and pale. 3 men stared at her. The quiet man from the back of the crowd was already moving. He grabbed a folded canvas tarp from the shed wall and threw one end to the nearest ranch hand. They stretched it along the left fence in about 15 seconds. Tamsin was already pointing to the opposite side. Riders, mounted. Line up here and hold. Don't chase them. Hold. The quiet man swung up onto a gray horse that had appeared from somewhere and positioned himself exactly where she'd pointed. 2 riders fell in beside him without being asked. The lead cattle hit the canvas wall and shied right. They curved away from the riders on the opposite side. The lane narrowed into a controlled path, and the animals slowed, then stopped, pressing forward. The group behind them stalled. The noise dropped. Tamsin stepped into the lane between the cattle and the wagons and held her ground. The lead animal looked at her. She looked back. She didn't move. It stopped. 46 seconds after the chain broke, the cattle were standing in a loose cluster at the far end of the lane, calm enough to be managed. No one had been hurt. The freezing rain started 23 minutes later. It came in sideways off the northern ridge, thin and sharp, the kind that coated grass in a layer of clear ice, before most people understood it had arrived. Lanterns in the yard burned orange through the wet air. Men who'd been laughing 10 minutes ago were now pulling their coats closed and looking at the sky. Hollis Vane, who owned Iron Crown Cattle Company and had said nothing during the crisis, stepped forward in the rain and told the gathered ranchers that the weather would pass quickly and there was no cause for alarm. He was a well-built man in his mid-50s, silver-haired, wearing a coat that cost more than some of the smaller ranchers made in a season. He spoke with the comfortable authority of someone who had never found a reason to doubt himself. A cold snap, he said. We've all seen worse. Several men nodded. Vane had that effect on people. Tamsin picked up her barometer from where she'd set it against the fence post. The quiet man was beside her, unsaddling the gray horse with efficient, unhurried movements. Bram called her, he said without looking up. Tamsin ran. He finished with the buckle. You said, the storm will be serious. I said the first killing freeze may come within 3 weeks. She looked at the rain collecting on the fence posts. This is early. Faster than I expected. What kind of work can you do beyond weather reading? She thought about the question honestly. Livestock triage, ration planning, route mapping. I built emergency feed systems and signal networks. I know this basin's terrain from my father's survey journals. He nodded slowly. Ash Creek Ranch breeds horses. We run a smaller cattle herd. I need someone to go through the winter preparations before the next storm. He paused. The work lasts until spring. Nothing beyond that. I didn't come looking for anything beyond spring, Tamsin said. He looked at her then directly for the first time. His eyes were an unusual shade gray with blue in them. Hard to name in poor light. Then come out tomorrow and tell me what I've done wrong, he said. She almost said, that depends on how much you've done wrong. She didn't. She said she'd be there. At first light, across the yard, through the rain and the lantern light, she saw a younger man standing near the edge of the crowd. He wasn't watching the cattle or the weather. He was watching her. Specifically, he was watching her hands, where she'd opened her saddlebag and slid out one of her basin maps. She marked a location in the southern valley, a protected hollow her father had noted years ago and never used. When she looked up, the young man turned away quickly. She noted his face. She noted where he'd been standing. Then she tucked the map away and walked back to her lodging through the freezing rain. Inside her small room, she set the barometer on the table beside the window and read the number one more time. It was lower than she had ever recorded in October, lower than anything she had in her father's journals. She sat with that for a long moment. Outside, the rain was already turning to ice on the windowsill. The basin didn't know yet what was coming. She did. Ash Creek Ranch sat lower than the surrounding range, tucked into a creek draw with cottonwood and willow along the banks and a long timber barn facing south. It was a working place. No paint on the fences, no decorative ironwork on the gate. Everything built to last and maintained carefully enough to prove it. Tamsin arrived at first light with one trunk, her instrument case, and her father's journals wrapped in oilcloth in her saddlebag. Bram met her in the yard. He showed her the small room near the kitchen, without ceremony a narrow bed, a wooden chair, a south-facing window, and 2 hooks on the wall. Functional. Clean. The agreement lasts through spring, he said. After that, the decision is yours and mine both. Tamsin set her instrument case on the chair. I came to manage a winter, not find a husband. Bram looked at her evenly. Good, he said. Then we understand each other. He left her to unpack. She spent the first hour walking the ranch, not the barn or the corrals, those could wait. She walked the fence lines, the feed shed, the wood store, the water supply, the grain storage, and the narrow covered space between the barn and the workshop where hay bales were stacked head high against the north wall. She came back inside with a list and a bad feeling. Bram was at the kitchen table with 2 of his ranch hands, a man named Walt and a younger one called Pete, going over freight paperwork. He looked up when she came in. Your hay stores are short, she said. I know the count, he said. We ordered enough for the season. What you ordered and what you received are 2 different numbers. She set the list on the table. Your receipts show 48 bales delivered in the 3rd week of October. I counted 31 full bales and several that were packed light. You're running close to 40% short of what you paid for. Walt glanced at Bram. Pete looked at the table. Bram picked up the list and read it. His expression didn't shift much, but she saw something tighten around his jaw. You're certain about the count? He said. Weigh one, she said. Anyone. They carried a bale to the yard scale. Bram balanced the beam himself. The bale came in nearly 12 pounds light. He pulled a second without being asked. That one was worse. He stood there for a moment with his hand on the scale arm. Then he said, all right, that was it. No argument, no explanation, no attempt to suggest she'd miscounted. He said all right and moved on. It was the first time Tamsin thought he might actually be worth working with. She spent the rest of the morning showing his hands how to reduce waste in the hay racks, tighter bundles, lower feeding positions, less scattered to the mud. Every bale needed to stretch. She walked them through it once, then had Pete repeat it back while she watched. He got it right on the 2nd try. After midday, she laid her father's terrain maps on the workshop table, beside a fresh basin map she'd sketched herself. She'd marked the fence lines in red and the prevailing wind direction in blue. These 2 sections, she said to Bram, pointing to the eastern fence. When the north wind comes in hard, snow will pile against them, not just drift pack, solid. Cattle pushing against it will either break through or suffocate under the slide. This section here needs to be moved 15 yards west. Bram studied the map. That fence took 2 weeks to build. I know, moving it will take another week. Then we should start today. He looked at her. She looked back. He called Walt in from the yard and told him to get the post diggers. That afternoon, 3 men worked in freezing mud while Tamsin and Bram marked the new line with stakes. She explained as they worked snow behavior in terrain like this, how low ground created false shelter that turned dangerous, how a fence placed wrong didn't just fail to protect cattle, it concentrated them in exactly the spot where conditions turned worst. Pete listened while he worked. Walt mostly just worked. Bram asked one question, about the angle of the second corner post, and she adjusted the stake 2 feet south. He didn't second-guess her again after that. By evening, the fence line was half relocated, and Tamsin had begun sketching the design for a movable feed sled. The concept was simple, a low wooden rack mounted on reinforced skids, heavy enough to stay put in wind, light enough for a draft team to move. If the approach route to a herd had to change, the feed moved with it. The animals followed the food. That was the whole idea. She and Bram sat across the workshop table with the sketch between them. He pointed at the runner width and said it needed to be wider for deep snow. She agreed without making it a discussion about who was right. "There's something else," she said. "The other ranches, if Ash Creek is short on hay, I'd bet 3 of them are worse. And the winter I'm describing doesn't stop at your fence line." Bram was quiet for a moment. Asking neighboring ranches to share is easier said than done. These men don't cooperate easily. "I'm not asking them to like each other," Tamsin said. "I'm asking them to decide whether their cattle matter more than their pride." He didn't answer right away. She took that as agreement, or at least consideration. The next morning, she rode the road between Ash Creek and Bitter Creek and began tying scarlet wool markers to the fence posts at intervals bright enough to stand against snow, high enough not to get buried in a moderate drift. When Walt saw her doing it, he called them women's decorations. She told him they'd look different during a whiteout. She'd finished the second mile of markers when she came back to find Bram in the yard with Hollis Vane. Vane was dressed for town, not for ranch work. Silver hair, good coat, a patient smile that didn't quite match his eyes. He had 2 riders behind him, which was one more than he needed for a courtesy call. He was offering Bram a renewed military horse contract, the kind of number that represented most of Ash Creek's stable income. Tamsin heard the figure as she rode in. She didn't dismount immediately. Vane glanced at her. "The offer includes a condition." "Naturally," he said, still speaking to Bram. "The association has concerns about outside consultants causing unnecessary alarm before winter. It would be better for everyone if Miss Wren continued her observations somewhere else." Bram looked at Tamsin briefly. Then he looked back at Vane. "No," he said. Vane seemed unsurprised. "The contract represents a significant amount." "I heard the number," Bram said. Vane nodded once as if recording the answer. He rode out with his 2 men without another word. Tamsin dismounted and walked her horse to the rail. Bram was watching the road. "He'll make it difficult," she said. "He already was," Bram answered and went back to the workshop. He didn't tell her about the contract that night or explain what refusing it would cost him. She only understood that later when she saw the freight ledger. At the time, she just noted that he'd refused it and kept moving. That evening, she tied the last scarlet marker at the Ash Creek gate post. The wind had picked up from the north again. Cold, purposeful wind, the kind that meant something. She went inside and reviewed her father's journals by lamplight. She was looking for the old basin loss records which ranches had sold cattle the year of the bad winter, which ones hadn't recovered, who'd bought the surviving herds at low prices. The same name appeared twice, Iron Crown. She closed the journal and sat with that for a while. Before she went to sleep, she checked the barometer. Still falling. In the morning, she walked out to check the first marker post on the east fence line. The ribbon was gone. Cut from the post, not pulled loose. The end was still there, clean and straight. She crouched and looked at the ground. The frost held boot prints that weren't from any of Bram's hands. Someone had come in from the eastern road before first light. She stood and looked back at the house. Then she looked at her saddlebag, hanging on the fence rail where she'd left it the night before. She crossed to it and opened the journal pocket. The clasp was unfastened. She always fastened the clasp. She counted the pages. One was missing. Before anyone else at Ash Creek was awake, Tamsin was in the north field with a handful of wooden stakes. There'd been a light snowfall overnight, maybe 2 inches, not enough to matter on its own. But snow on flat ground told a story if you knew how to read it, where it mounded, where it scattered, where it packed against a fence post versus drifted soft and loose. Every irregularity meant something about what the ground and wind would do when the serious weather arrived. She was working in a line across the field, pressing stakes into the spots where accumulation had already begun to concentrate, when she heard boots crunching across the crust behind her. Bram stopped a few yards away, looking at what she was doing. He had a coffee cup in one hand, and his breath was steaming in the cold air. Even shallow snow tells you where the deep drifts build, she said, without turning around. These spots here and here will be 5 feet high by January if the fence stays where it is. I moved that section yesterday. She pressed another stake into the ground. This one needs a barrier. Low, angled into the wind. It doesn't stop the snow. It just moves the pile to somewhere it can't trap cattle against a wall. He watched her finish the line. Then he said, "Show me." She spent the next hour walking him through the logic, wind direction, ground slope, the way a slight rise in terrain could either protect or funnel, depending on which side the storm came from. It was knowledge her father had built over 20 years of watching livestock losses. She'd learned it young enough that it felt obvious, but she'd stopped expecting it to feel obvious to anyone else. Bram asked 2 questions. Both were practical. He wasn't testing her. He was learning, which was different. Back in the workshop, they built the first full-scale feed sled, together with Walt and Pete. The runners were wider than her original sketch, Bram's correction from the night before. The rack was set low enough to be filled from ground level, but high enough to keep feet out of the mud. It took most of the morning. When Amos Pike rode into the yard just before noon, Tamsin was covered in sawdust and not in a forgiving mood. Amos didn't look much better. He'd ridden hard, and his face had the particular expression of a man who needed help and was angry about needing it. "Cattle," he said to Bram, mostly. 3 of them down since yesterday. 2 more won't eat. Started with bloat. Now they're weak and off their legs. Bram looked at Tamsin. Amos did not look at Tamsin. "I'll come and look." Amos finally looked at her then. "I didn't know," she said, and went to saddle her horse. Pike Ridge was an hour's ride east. When they arrived, the sick animals were penned near the main barn. Tamsin walked the pen slowly, crouching beside each animal in turn. She checked breath, eyes, the condition of the hide, the quality of what they'd voided. Then she went to the hay storage. The wall on the northeast corner of the storage shed was damp. Not dramatically, just a gray seeping through the lower boards. Enough to have been wicking moisture into the hay, stored against it for weeks. The bottom layers were soft, slightly warm, and smelled faintly wrong. "How long has this wall been leaking?" she asked. Amos crossed his arms. "It's always sweat a little in fall. The hay stored against it has been composting slowly. That's what's making your cattle sick." She straightened up. "Pull everything away from this wall today. Dry what you can salvage. The rest needs to come out of the feed rotation entirely. I lose half a month's stored hay doing that. You lose the cattle if you don't." A silence sat between them. Amos was a man who'd survived a long time by trusting his own judgment. And she just told him his judgment had been poisoning his herd. That was hard to receive gracefully. He didn't receive it gracefully, but he followed her instructions. Dr. Mercy Holt arrived while they were clearing the hay. She was a compact, deliberate woman with her sleeves already rolled up before she'd fully dismounted. She examined the sick cattle herself and gave Tamsin a brief nod. "Your read is right," Mercy said. "Moldy forage. I've seen 2 cases similar this fall." She looked at Amos. "You were lucky she came today." Amos said nothing. On the ride back to Ash Creek, Tamsin mentioned the signal network to Bram for the first time, what it would actually require, not just the concept. Lantern codes between ranches, bell patterns, marked stations at intervals along the main routes so riders could find their way during a whiteout. Shared shelter points. 6 ranches connected, she said. If one has a crisis, the others know within an hour. They'll say it's an overreach, Bram said. Every man out here believes his operation is his alone. Then their cattle will die alone, she said. He thought about that for a while. What would you need to start? She told him. It wasn't complicated. Wool, lantern oil, timber for the shelter frames, willing hands. The ranches already had most of it. What they lacked was agreement. Back at Ash Creek, Cora Bellamy was waiting in the yard. She ran the Bitter Creek boarding house and had driven out herself, which meant she'd wanted to speak, without other ears around. She and Tamsin sat at the kitchen table while Bram's hands worked outside. Cora had heard about the signal network idea from Mercy. She wanted to organize the sewing flags, markers, signal cloths. She knew which ranch wives were good with heavy fabric and which families had children who could carry messages on horseback in moderate conditions. She knew where there were extra lanterns and who had surplus oil. You're thinking about the cattle, Cora said. That's right, but there are families out on those spreads who'll be just as isolated. Someone needs to think about them, too. Then you're the person to do that, Tamsin said. Cora nodded, like that was already settled. That evening, after Cora had gone, Tamsin sat in the workshop, going through the old ranch loss records she'd borrowed from the Cattle Association Hall. Bram came in to check on the sled's drying timber and stayed without making a ceremony of it. He talked briefly about his brother. Just a few words that Tobin had worked cattle from the time he was young, that he'd been quick and reliable in bad weather. He stopped before he got to anything harder. She heard what he was leaving out and didn't press him. She told him about her father's last winter. Not the accusation, not Vane, just the night. Alaric rode out in the storm toward a group of stranded travelers and didn't come back, she said it plainly. Bram didn't reach for anything comforting to say. He just listened, and that was better. Later, when she was alone, she opened the journal again. She'd been trying to decode the older entries her father had written in his abbreviated shorthand, the ones from the year of the bad storm. She found the section she'd read 3 nights before and moved forward from it. There was a notation in the margin, small careful lettering, warning forwarded. H. Vane received, confirmed via depot wire. Departure changed after. B. Calder approved the route. Departure changed afterward. She read it twice. Then she set the journal down and looked at the wall for a long moment. Bram Calder had approved the route used during the drive that killed his brother. He'd told her part of this. He'd told her Tobin had died in a storm. He'd said Vane had changed things. He hadn't told her his initials were in her father's record. He hadn't told her what that meant, or what he knew, or how long he'd known it. She closed the journal and tied the oilcloth back around it carefully. Outside, the wind was coming down off of the ridge again, cold and direct. She blew out the lamp and sat in the dark for a while, thinking. Vane arrived at Ash Creek on a Tuesday morning, which was deliberate. Tuesdays were when the freight riders came through, which meant there would be witnesses. He rode in with 2 men and a leather document case across his saddle. He waited in the yard until Bram came out of the barn. Then he dismounted and opened the case without preamble. The contract was real. Tamsin could see that from where she stood near the workshop door, official paper, territorial seal, the kind of figures that represented the better part of a year's income for a horse operation. Military remount work was steady and reliable, and Vane knew exactly what it meant to Ash Creek. The association has put together something more substantial than before, Vane said pleasantly. Given the quality of your breeding stock, it seemed fair to reflect that. Bram looked at the contract. He didn't pick it up. There's a condition, Bram said. It wasn't a question, Vane smiled briefly. Miss Wren has been circulating ideas that are making smaller operators anxious. Feed shortages, catastrophics, storms, coordinated preparations. He paused. It unsettles the market when people panic unnecessarily. The association feels it would be better if she continued her work somewhere north of the basin. Bram looked up from the contract. No, the figure is generous. I heard the figure, Bram said. Vane studied him for a moment. Then he looked past Bram directly at Tamsin. His expression was pleasant, the way a winter sky was pleasant clear, cold, offering nothing. Your father made similar errors in judgment, he said to her, issuing warnings that caused unnecessary disruption. I imagine you know how that ended for him. Tamsin held his gaze. I know exactly how it ended for him, she said. Vane closed the document case. He remounted without another word and rode out with his 2 men behind him. Bram stood in the yard watching the road. Tamsin watched Bram. That figure would have covered wages through spring, she said. Yes, he said, and walked back into the barn. She let him go. There were other things she needed to say to him, but not yet. She went back to the workshop and opened her father's journal to the entry she'd found 3 nights before. B. Calder approved the route. Departure changed afterward. She'd been thinking about it carefully, which was different from jumping to conclusions. The entry said what it said. It didn't say Bram knew about the warning. It didn't say he'd changed the departure himself, but it said his initials were there, beside the original route, and he hadn't mentioned it. She waited until the freight riders had gone, and the yard was quiet. Then she went to the barn. Bram was checking a mare's near foreleg, running his hand down from the knee. He didn't look up when she came in. She set the journal open on the stall partition in front of him and pointed to the entry. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he straightened up and took a slow breath. I designed the route, he said. I know, it was a good route, he said, based on the forecast I was given. The conditions that morning were cold but manageable. I approved the departure based on what I had. But Vane changed it afterward, she said. That's what my father recorded. He moved the departure time forward by 4 hours. I didn't know until after. Bram's voice stayed level, but she could hear the weight behind it. By the time I found out, Tobin was already with the rear herd. The storm moved faster than anyone expected. The rear group didn't make the shelter. Tamsin waited. I should have told you. Yes, she said. You should have, I thought. If you saw my initials in your father's record, you'd believe I helped Vane destroy him, that I was part of what happened to your family. Hiding it gave Vane exactly the leverage he needed over you, she said. It still does. He knows you haven't told me. He knows you haven't told anyone. She picked up the journal. When powerful men know a secret you're ashamed of, they use it. My father learned that. He tried to fight Vane without enough evidence, and Vane used every piece of my father's uncertainty against him. Bram was quiet for a moment. I know. Then stopped making it easy for him. She didn't ask him to apologize. She didn't wait for one either. There was too much work to do. That same afternoon, she and Jonah Red Elk rode out to inspect Cottonwood Hollow. Jonah had arrived at Ash Creek 2 days earlier, bringing 4 horses and a quiet familiarity with Bram that suggested a long history. He was an eastern Shoshone horseman who knew the basin's hidden draws and sheltered valleys better than anyone. He didn't talk much, but what he said was accurate. The hollow was a wide, bowl-shaped depression south of the main range, cupped by broken ridges that blocked the worst of the northern wind. Cottonwood growth lined the inner edges, and the ground was thick with dead grass that hadn't been overgrazed. It was good shelter, better than anything the open range could offer. But when they reached the western entrance, they found timber. Not fallen timber. Cut timber. Logs dropped deliberately across the narrow passage, 2 layers deep, pinned in place with stakes driven into the frozen ground. Someone had done this recently. The cut ends were still pale. Eastern entrance, Jonah said. They rode around. That one was worse. The same method, more logs, and a section of heavy brush piled on top. This took several men and most of a day, Tamsin said. Jonah nodded. He'd already dismounted and was reading the ground. Boot prints, more than one set, and the marks of a sled. Something heavy had been dragged in from the north. While they were examining the eastern blockage, a sharp crack came from the ridge above them. One shot not aimed at them a warning or a signal. Both horses shied hard. Tamsin's mare swung sideways in the icy footing, and she lost a stirrup before she got the animal settled. They cleared the hollow fast. Bram met them on the trail an hour out, and they rode back together, Tamsin explaining what they'd found, Jonah adding the details about the tracks and the sled. Bram's expression didn't change much, but he asked twice about the cut ends of the timber, wanting to understand the timing. When they came back to Ash Creek, there was smoke on the southern horizon. It was the cooperative hay shelter, the shared storage they'd been building with 3 neighboring ranches, about 2 miles south on neutral ground. By the time they reached it, the structure was mostly gone. A few charred posts, melted iron fittings, and the smell of wet, burned timber in the cold air. And on the ground near the remains of the entry gate, a coat, heavy canvas, dark green. Tamsin picked it up. She turned it over. Inside the collar, a name had been written in ink on a strip of hide, L. Creed. She'd seen Lyle Creed twice, the young Iron Crown rider who'd watched her mark the basin map on the night of the auction. She'd noted his face then. Inside the coat's right pocket, folded twice, was a page. She recognized the paper before she opened it. The weight, the slight discoloration at the edge. It was from her father's journal. The missing page. She stood there, holding it in both hands, while Bram crouched near the burned gate and studied the footing around the base posts. "Someone wants us to find this," she said. Bram looked up. "The coat's too visible. The page is too obvious." "He was supposed to be the one who did this," she said. "That's what Vane wants us to believe." She folded the page carefully and put it back in her own journal where it belonged. What she didn't say out loud, not yet, was that she'd been watching Lyle Creed's face at the auction. He'd been afraid, not calculating. She knew the difference. Whatever he'd done, he hadn't done all of it willingly. Later, after dark, she wrote it out plainly in her own notes. Creed removed markers and stole the journal page, then changed his mind. Vane found out, took the coat, planted the page. Creed didn't start the fire. She didn't know for certain, but the logic held. Bram came to the doorway of the workshop where she was writing and leaned against the frame. "Lyle's gone," he said. "No one's seen him since this morning." She put her pen down. "The coat was warm when we found it," she said. Bram understood what she meant. He went out to check the fence line himself, taking a lantern. He came back 20 minutes later and told her there was blood on a broken rail at the eastern edge of the property. The rail had been hit hard enough to crack. She sat for a moment with that information. Then she went back to her notes and added one more line. Creed may not have left on his own terms. The blizzard hit Ash Creek 2 hours past midnight. Tamsin heard it before she felt it, a low, sustained roar from the north that built fast, the sound of wind hitting terrain hard and not slowing down. She was already up and dressed by the time the first gusts rattled the workshop shutters. She stepped outside, and the cold hit her like a wall, actual physical distance. She had to lean into it to make the barn. Bram was already there, lantern up, listening. Walt and Pete were pulling on their coats. From beyond the northern fence, a sound came through the storm. Low, irregular, building. Cattle bawling. Bram went still. "That's not my herd." He climbed the fence rail and held the lantern out. In the brief flicker of light beyond the snow, shapes moved. Dozens of them, close, getting closer, heads down and running blind. "Pike Ridge," Tamsin said. Amos's herd had broken out. In a blizzard with no landmarks, cattle ran toward the only visible light. Right now, that was the lantern in Bram's hand. She did the calculation fast. A herd that size, moving that speed, would hit the barnyard in under 4 minutes. The horses were in those barns. So was every bale of feed Ash Creek had. "Move the lanterns," she said. "All of them. Pull every light out of the barn and the yard and reset them in a wide curve southeast. Make the lights the path, not the building." Pete ran. Walt looked at Bram. Bram said go, and Walt ran. Tamsin turned to Bram. "I need mounted riders on the east side, not to chase them, to hold the flank. The cattle will move away from pressure if the pressure is steady and the light gives them somewhere to go." "Jonah," Bram said, and Jonah was already pulling a saddle off the rack. Bram took the gray horse and was out of the barn before Tamsin had finished her next sentence. She grabbed a lantern from the wall and ran toward the northern fence line. The lead animals were 40 yards out when she reached the fence. She could see them in the poor light, 6, maybe 8, running hard with the rest of the herd pressing behind. Their eyes were white-rimmed, and they were following each other, not thinking, which was both the problem and the solution. Turn the leaders, and the rest would follow. Keep the leaders moving in the right direction, and you didn't need to stop the whole herd. She moved her lantern in a slow, deliberate arc to the right, left hand on the fence post for balance. Then she stepped over the fence into the dark. Bram saw her from horseback and said something she couldn't hear over the wind. The lead animals hit the light and curved around it, not dramatically, just enough. The line of lanterns Walt and Pete had reset created a corridor, and the lead cattle found it the way cattle always found the path of least resistance, by moving away from the edge of what they couldn't see into the shape of what they could. The mobile feed sled they'd built 3 days ago was sitting in the southeast draw. Bram and Jonah pushed it diagonally across the inside of the curve, not blocking the cattle, but interrupting the forward pressure enough to slow the rear groups. The scent of hay reached the wind and carried north. The lead animals slowed. Tamsin's mare chose that moment to spin sideways on a patch of ice beneath the snow. She went off hard, left shoulder and hip, and the lantern flew out of her hand. She got up immediately, which was the right instinct. Even if her left hand was already going wrong, she could feel the cold hitting the exposed skin where her glove had come off. She found the glove in the snow and got it back on. Bram was beside her in seconds. He didn't haul her up or make a scene about it. He just put one hand on her arm to check she was standing right, read her face, and turned back to the herd. The cattle were slowing, moving in a broad southward arc. A few broke from the outer edge and had to be pushed back by Jonah and one of Ash Creek's trained horses, but the lead group was already into the draw. Bram opened the south gate. Tamsin understood what that meant. That gate opened into Ash Creek's winter pasture, the sheltered draw where their own cattle were. He was offering his protected ground to Amos Pike's runaway herd. Everything he had in reserve was behind that gate. He opened it without hesitation. The combined cattle settled into the draw by the time the storm reached full intensity. It took another hour to close the passages and confirm the count. During that time, Tamsin's left hand had stiffened inside the glove. When Mercy arrived, she'd ridden out from the north road when she saw the light signals, which was exactly why the signals existed. She checked the hand by lantern light and told Tamsin to make a fist. "You can feel this?" Mercy pressed 2 fingers against the outside of Tamsin's hand. "Yes. Good, no permanent damage. Keep it warm and dry for the next 6 hours." Mercy gave her a look that meant she expected to be obeyed. "That means indoors." Tamsin stayed outside for another 40 minutes. Amos Pike arrived on foot, which meant his horse had gotten loose in the storm. He came in through the south gate, with his hat battered sideways and ice in his beard, and behind him, held up between 2 of his riders, was a boy of maybe 16. The boy had a bad leg, not broken, but badly twisted, and he'd been out in the storm long enough to be shaking hard. Mercy took the boy inside, and Tamsin heard Amos's voice from the yard. She couldn't make out words, just the tone. He was asking after his son, and trying not to show how frightened he'd been. Bram told him the boy would be all right. A silence. Then Amos said, quietly enough that Tamsin almost missed it over the wind, "I'll sign whatever paper you put in front of me." Bram said, "We don't need paper. We need your riders on the east flank 3 weeks from now when the next storm comes." Later, when the worst of the wind had settled into a steady, bitter cold, and the cattle were calm in the draw, Tamsin crouched beside the south fence with a lantern and looked at the ground where the Pike Ridge herd had come through. She found what she expected to find. The outer gate at Pike Ridge hadn't failed on its own. The latch mechanism was a three-part design. Bram had described it to her when they'd reviewed emergency exit routes. All three parts failing simultaneously in a single storm was unlikely. Someone opened it, she said. Jonah crouched beside her and looked. He nodded. He'd found something else. He came back from the southern darkness an hour later, carrying a section of rope with a knot she didn't recognize. It was attached to a stake driven into the ground along a trail that led south, away from the main range, toward timber country. Iron Crown, he said. He handed her the rope end. Trail leads south. They've been moving cattle. Large numbers. Probably before the snow. She held the rope in her wrapped hand. If Vane had moved his herd south before winter hit, he'd known this winter was coming. He hadn't been uncertain. He'd been prepared. While every other ranch in the basin scrambled for feed and braced for the worst, Iron Crown's best breeding stock was already sitting in protected country. 3 days later, a folded paper appeared under the door of the Ash Creek workshop. No name on the outside. Inside was a torn corner from a larger letter, the ink smeared in one place from damp. She read it in the lamplight. Acquisition of distressed ranching operations, expected Q1, pending winter losses. Arrangements confirmed with 2 eastern parties. Livestock to be purchased at, the rest had been torn away. But the letterhead at the top was still intact. 2 initials and a symbol she recognized from the freight depot. Invoices. Iron Crown. She set it on the table and looked at it for a long time. Vane wasn't just waiting for the other ranches to fail. He'd arranged financing. He'd made deals. He had buyers lined up for the surviving cattle and contracts ready for the grazing rights. He needed the smaller ranches to fail on schedule. Cottonwood Hollow, the blocked entrances, the underweight hay, the missing markers, none of it was improvised. It was managed. This winter was supposed to be the instrument of a purchase plan that was already signed and waiting. She folded the torn letter carefully and added it to her journal beside the restored missing page. Jonah came in from outside, stamping snow from his boots. He set something on the table beside her journal, a section of heavy chain, new iron, recently cut. Hollow's eastern entrance, he said. They're not just blocking it. They're building a barrier. He looked at her steadily. If cattle get into that passage, the chain crosses at shoulder height. They'd pile up against it. Tamsin looked at the chain, not just keeping cattle out of the refuge. Building something that could trap a panicked herd inside the wrong corridor, send them into a dead end during a whiteout, and they'd crush each other against the barrier. She picked up her pencil and went back to the map. She drew the hollow again from memory, marked both blocked entrances, marked the chain position, and drew a line north to Gray Fork. She looked at the line for a moment. Then she understood what the plan was supposed to look like from Vane's side. Not just passive failure, active destruction. She started writing faster. The territorial weather supervisor arrived on the Wednesday morning stage, which was the only stage that came through Bitter Creek in winter. He was a trim man in a good coat named Aldous Fenn, and he carried a letter from the Cheyenne office with both hands, as though delivering something fragile. He found Tamsin at Ash Creek's workshop table, surrounded by maps and feed ledgers, and set the letter in front of her with a small, formal nod. She read it without picking it up. A paid position. Official title. An observation room in Cheyenne with proper instruments, telegraph access, and a staff of 2. Recognition from the territorial office for the quality of her winter reports, which Mercy had been forwarding south every 2 weeks. Without telling Tamsin she was doing it, train ticket was included. It was dated 2 days from now. Fenn sat across from her and folded his hands. The office considers your work this season to be exceptional, he said. This position represents a genuine opportunity, Miss Wren, the kind that doesn't come around often for someone in your situation. She knew what someone in your situation meant, a woman without institutional backing, working without pay on borrowed credibility in a place where half the ranchers had laughed at her 6 weeks ago. She folded the letter and put it down. I'll consider it, she said. Fenn looked mildly surprised. He'd clearly expected a faster answer. Bram heard about the offer an hour later. He came into the workshop, read her face, and sat down across from her without being asked. "You should go," he said. She looked at him. "I mean it," he said. "What they're offering is what you came west to build. A station, a title, resources. None of that exists here." He paused. "I'm not going to tell you the basin needs you more than Cheyenne does. Is that your opinion or your conscience?" She said both. She appreciated that he didn't dress it up. She didn't say so. That same afternoon, Vane's response to Bram's refusal arrived in a different form. Not a conversation this time. A letter from the military freight office in Laramie informing Ash Creek Ranch that its remount contract had been suspended pending review of supply reliability concerns. Then a second letter from the Basin Freight Cooperative canceling Ash Creek's winter haulage agreement, effective immediately. Both letters had been processed too quickly. That kind of paperwork took weeks under normal circumstances. Someone had started the process before the contracts were officially refused. Vane had already assumed Bram would refuse. Bram read both letters at the kitchen table and set them down without comment. Walt and Pete were in the doorway. He looked at them. "Wages through the end of the month are guaranteed," he said. "After that, I can't promise anything past 2 weeks at a time." Walt said he wasn't going anywhere. Pete said the same, then looked at his boots. By evening, 2 of the other hands had quietly packed their gear. Tamsin saw them ride out from the workshop window. She didn't blame them. A man couldn't feed his family on loyalty. She sat down and wrote out the full cooperative plan in clear language. Every signal code, every route, every feed station location, every weather indicator she used, and what it meant. If she left, the plan could continue. She'd built it to function without her standing next to it. She was on the 3rd page when she heard the crack. It was sharp and sudden, like a beam giving way. She was out the door before she'd finished thinking about it. The Eastern Feed shelter, not the shared one that had burned, but the smaller one built against the slope behind the barn, had collapsed under snow load. The roof had caved in at the center, dropping heavy timbers across the interior. From inside, someone was making noise, not screaming. A low sound, controlled, which meant the person was conscious and trying to manage the pain. Bram was already there, pulling at the outer boards. Jonah arrived from the barn with a pry bar. Tamsin took one side of a heavy crossbeam and waited for Bram to count. They lifted together. The beam moved enough for Jonah to drag the person out. It was Lyle Creed. He was in bad shape ribs on the left side, possibly broken, and a long gash along his forearm from a nail or a splintered board. His face was pale, and he was breathing carefully, the deliberate, slow breathing of someone managing pain consciously. Mercy arrived within the hour, sent for by Pete, who'd ridden hard. She cleaned the arm and bound the ribs and told Lyle to stay flat. Lyle looked at Tamsin from the floor of the workshop where they'd put him. He'd been watching her for several minutes. "I took the markers down," he said. His voice was strained but clear. "3 of them, between here and the Bitter Creek Road, and I took the page from your journal." Tamsin crouched beside him. "I know," she said. "Tell me why." "Vane holds the debt on my mother's property. 3 years of back payments." He stopped to breathe. He told me it was just information. "Keep him informed about what you were doing. Move the markers so the signal route looked unreliable." Another breath. "I was going to give the page back. I'd already decided. But he figured out I was going to." "He took your coat," Tamsin said. Lyle closed his eyes briefly. He said it was a mistake to trust someone who couldn't follow through. The next day, the shelter burned. They told me to stay quiet, or my mother loses the property. Mercy looked at Tamsin over Lyle's head. The expression was clear. Let him rest. Tamsin held up one hand. "The Cottonwood Hollow blockage. The feed barns." "Where Juniper breaks," Lyle said. "South of the timberline, about 6 miles. 3 barns. He's had hay stored there since September." He paused. "He's planning to take the emergency supply depot, too. Everything the smaller ranches would need in February." Tamsin stood up. She went back to the workshop and looked at the letter from Cheyenne. She picked up her pen and wrote a single line of reply, folded it, and left it on the table. She didn't send it that night. In the morning, she gave it to Bram. He read it. He looked up at her, and she could see him deciding not to say anything about what it meant. She took the letter back from him and handed it to Pete. "Give this to Fen when he comes through, for the morning stage," she said. Pete took it. It declined the position. 2 nights later, Tam was in the barn checking on the horses when she heard a sound she didn't recognize, not wind, not livestock, a sharp metallic rhythm from the south pasture. She came outside with a lantern and found the south pasture gate open and the horse herd moving. Not all of them, the mares, and 3 younger horses, had already cleared the fence. The stallion was running the fence line, panicked, and he hit the wire section at the eastern corner at full speed. Bram was there in 2 minutes, and Tamsin watched him work, calm, direct, no wasted movement. He got between the stallion and the fence and talked the animal down, which took patience and nerve in equal measure. But when the horse finally stopped moving, she could see the damage. A deep gash along the right shoulder into the muscle. The stallion would heal, but it would be months before he could work. And a breeding operation without its primary stallion lost income it couldn't easily replace. She held the lantern while Bram cleaned and packed the wound. His hands were steady. His face wasn't. 3 days after that, the ultimatum came. A written note delivered to the Ash Creek gate and left tied to the post with a leather cord. Deliver Wren's maps and withdraw from the cooperative. In exchange, Iron Crown will release sufficient hay from current holdings to sustain Ash Creek and 2 neighboring ranches through February. Refuse, and every commercial depot in the basin will remain closed to your cooperative's accounts. Bram brought it to Tamsin. She read it once. Then she took it to the kitchen fire and dropped it in. "All right," she said, and went back to the maps. They came to Ash Creek on a Thursday, when the temperature had dropped enough to make every breath hurt. 8 ranchers in total, some with their foremen, crowding the kitchen and the workshop and spilling into the hall. They'd heard about Vane's ultimatum from 2 different directions, and they'd ridden out to discuss it, which in practice meant they'd ridden out to argue. A man named Garrett, who ran the smallest of the 6 cooperating ranches, said at first, "The maps for the feed. That's a trade. It's not complicated." Several others shifted in agreement. Tamsin stood at the workshop table and waited for the noise to settle. "We give him the maps and he controls the route," she said. "He knows where the hollow is, where the signal stations are, where we plan to move the cattle in the worst conditions. He won't honor the feed agreement. He'll use the information to block the route and scatter the herd." "We're short on hay now," Garrett said. "I know. What you know and what my cattle need are 2 different problems." Bram spoke from the doorway. "Give him false maps." Tamsin turned. The room went quiet. "Draw the routes wrong," Bram said. "Cottonwood Hollow in the wrong position. Signal stations mislabeled. He thinks he has the plan, but what he has is a drawing that leads his riders the wrong direction in a whiteout." Tamsin looked at him evenly, and when he figures out the maps are false, which he will, he comes at us harder and faster, and we've lost the time we needed to finish the Rio preparations. She paused. "It's another decision made without telling me, Bram. You've done this before." The room was very quiet now. Bram held her gaze. He didn't argue the point. She looked at the ranchers. "I'm moving part of the cooperative's coordination to Cora's boarding house. It's more central and harder for Iron Crown to monitor. Anyone who wants to keep working the plan meets there tomorrow morning." Most of them nodded. Garrett left without committing either way. After the others had gone, Tamsin was rolling the maps when Bram spoke. "I need to tell you something," he said. "All of it, not a piece of it." She stopped what she was doing. He told her the full story of Tobin's death, not the abbreviated version she'd gotten in the barn, the complete account. He'd been route supervisor for Iron Crown. He'd drawn the trail, calculated the water stops, and the shelter timing approved the departure window based on the morning forecast. Vane had called him into the office 2 hours before the drive left and told him there'd been a forecast update, but nothing significant. Bram had believed him. "I ordered Tobin to stay with the rear herd," he said. "The rear always moved slower. I thought it was the safer assignment. I thought I was protecting him." His voice stayed even but barely. The storm closed the trail before the rear herd reached the shelter. 12 riders. Tobin was one of 4 who didn't make it out. Tamsin sat down across from him. "I left Iron Crown the following spring," he said. "I built Ash Creek because it was small enough that my decisions only put my own property at risk. I've kept it that way deliberately, and Vane let you believe it was your fault," she said. He never said it directly. He didn't have to. He was very good at letting a silence mean whatever the other person needed it to mean. "That's how he keeps people," she said. "Guilt is a debt you can never finish paying." He knew that. Bram was quiet for a moment. "Guilt doesn't give you the right to make every decision alone," she said. "It's not protection. It just looks like protection." He looked at her. "I know that. Now." She stood and picked up the rolled maps. She was halfway to the door when he said her name. She stopped. "I should have told you everything before you found it in the journal," he said. "Not because you needed to trust me to run the plan, because you deserved the truth." She turned around. There wasn't a good response to that. There wasn't a clean resolution that fit inside the remaining hours before another storm. She crossed back to where he was standing, and she kissed him once brief decided. Not soft, and then stepped back. "Don't make another decision without telling me first," she said. "I won't," he said. She believed him. That was the thing that surprised her. She went back to the maps. An hour later, Deputy Russell Dane rode into the yard with 4 association riders. He knocked on the workshop door with the courtesy of a man who didn't enjoy what he was about to do. "I need to speak with Bram Calder," he said. Russell was a careful man. He wasn't corrupt, and he wasn't stupid. He explained it plainly. Marked feed had been found in Ash Creek's barn. 6 bales, pulled from the commercial depot stock, carrying identification marks that proved they'd come from the municipal emergency supply. Someone reported seeing Calder's freight wagon at the depot access road last week, Russell said to Tamsin, since Bram was already standing in the barn doorway, listening. Bram said, "I wasn't at the depot last week." "I believe you may not have been," Russell said carefully, "but I have a witness, and I have marked feed in your barn, and that requires me to act on it." Tamsin looked at the bales Russell's rider had stacked in the yard. She walked over and looked closely at the tally marks on the burlap. The marks were Iron Crown's private system. She'd seen it on the depot invoices Lyle had described. But nobody else in the room was going to know that without an explanation. Bram walked out of the barn and stood in front of Russell. "If I resist, your riders have to make a decision and someone gets hurt," he said. "I'm not going to do that to my people." He submitted to the arrest without another word. Tamsin stood in the yard and watched Russell lead him out. Then she went back inside and took command of Ash Creek's winter operations, as though that had always been the arrangement. 2 hours after dark, Pete came running from the South Road. Lyle Creed, who'd been resting in the boarding house under Mercy's instructions, had left on foot toward Bitter Creek. An Iron Crown rider had intercepted him on the South Road before he reached the deputy's office. Pete had heard a shot. Tamsin was already moving for the door. They found Lyle at Cora's boarding house. He'd crawled the last quarter-mile after the shot, which told her everything she needed to know about how much he'd wanted to reach them. Mercy went straight to work on the wound, which was in the upper left arm and had missed the bone. Before he went under from the pain and the cold and the blood loss, Lyle grabbed Tamsin's wrist. "Vane means to open every north gate," he said, "during the next whiteout. He wants the cattle moving before anyone knows what's happening." Then he let go, and his eyes closed. Tamsin stood straight. She looked at Cora, who was already moving to heat water, at Mercy, who was working with both hands, and didn't look up. at Pete standing in the doorway, with snow still on his coat. Outside, the wind was picking up from the north. She went to the window and looked at the sky. The next whiteout wasn't days away. It was tomorrow. Tamsin's barometer, reading at 4 in the morning, was the lowest she'd recorded all winter. She didn't need to check it twice. She'd been watching the instrument for months, and she knew what the numbers meant. The storm would arrive by afternoon. Not a gradual buildup, a front moving fast, the kind that hit a basin like a door slamming shut. 18 hours, maybe less. She wrote the estimate on a strip of paper and sent Pete to Cora's boarding house before first light. Mercy had stabilized Lyle overnight. The bullet had torn through muscle, but missed the bone, and Lyle had made it to the boarding house under his own power, which suggested more endurance than anyone had given him credit for. He was pale and running a fever, but conscious. Mercy said he'd keep the arm if he stayed still. He gave his full statement to Cora, who wrote it down in clear longhand. Every detail. The coat, the fire, the journal page, the names of the riders who'd placed the false feed at Ash Creek, the location of Vane's private barns at Juniper Breaks. All of it. Cora sent the statement to Russell Dane at the deputy's office before breakfast. Russell examined the bales in his yard again. He looked at the tally marks on the burlap. He sent one of his riders to the depot with a copy of the marks and a question about Iron Crown's private ledger system. The rider came back in an hour. Russell came to the boarding house himself. He didn't fully release Bram. Tamsin had expected that and didn't argue with it. Russell was a careful man, and careful men didn't undo arrests on the basis of one wounded witness, even a credible one. What he did instead was practical. The storm made transferring Bram to Laramie impossible for at least 2 days. A livestock emergency of this scale put every ranching family in the basin at risk. Russell suspended the transport order and placed Bram under his direct supervision, authorized to assist with the emergency operation until conditions allowed a proper transfer. It was the most Russell could do within the law, and he did it without being asked. Bram walked into the boarding house kitchen and found Tamsin at the table with her maps. He sat down across from her. She looked up. "I need you on the western turning line," she said. "You'll have Jonah and 4 riders. The trained horses go with that group." "Understood," he said. "I'm running the forward signal point myself. Cora manages the bell codes from the church. Mercy handles injured riders and animals at the rear staging area." She looked back at the map. "Amos takes the eastern flank." Bram studied the plan for a moment. Then he said, "What do you need from me right now?" "Nothing yet. Go check the western passage into the hollow." He stood, put on his coat, and went. No discussion about strategy, no suggestion that he knew better, no attempt to reframe her plan as a joint decision. He took the assignment and left. Russell, standing near the door, watched this and said nothing. By mid-morning, the cooperative was moving. Tamsin had divided the combined herd, approximately 1,050 cattle, into 3 controlled groups at the northern holding ground. The original plan was to push all 3 groups through the western passage into Cottonwood Hollow before the storm hit. Clean, straightforward, 2 hours of work in decent visibility. Then Jonah rode back from the north with news that 4 signal poles on the main route had been knocked down. Iron Crown riders had also taken the northern warming station, which meant any rider caught in the storm without shelter on the northern approach was exposed. Tamsin stood in the cold and looked at the gap in her signal network. She replaced it. Not elegantly, there wasn't time for elegant. She worked through the logic out loud with Cora and a young rider named Fenn, who'd been doing message work all season. Church bells for distance communication, 2 patterns, 1 for hold position, 1 for advance. Timed rifle shots at the ridge stations to confirm receipt. Lantern sleds moved by draft teams to create visible route markers when the snow cut visibility to 10 feet. Mounted messengers for anything that needed words. It wasn't as clean as the original network. It was good enough. Amos arrived with his riders at noon and pulled Tamsin aside. "Tell me where you need me," he said. No preamble, no qualification. She pointed to the eastern flank on the map. He studied it for 30 seconds and nodded. By early afternoon, the first group of cattle was moving south. Amos positioned his riders on the eastern edge with the steadiness of a man who'd made a decision and stopped reconsidering it. The cattle moved well in the early calm before the storm arrived. Then the front hit. It came in faster than Tamsin's estimate, which told her the pressure had collapsed even further overnight. The visibility dropped from a quarter mile to 30 yards in under 10 minutes. The temperature fell hard. She was at the rear of the second group when one of Fenn's riders came through. The white news, Iron Crown riders had overpowered the guards at the northern holding ground. The third group was exposed, and the gates were opening. Not all of them. Specific gates on the northern boundary positioned to push frightened cattle south and east, away from Cottonwood Hollow, toward the river. The three groups merged in the confusion of the whiteout riders, losing sight of each other. Cattle pressing together. The noise of the storm swallowing every signal. What had been three managed groups became one mass of approximately 1,050 animals moving in the same direction, and the wind had shifted east. Tamsin felt it on her face before she understood what it meant. Then she understood. The original corridor ran southwest. With an eastern wind pushing the lead cattle, the natural direction of movement curved north toward Gray Fork. She pulled out her compass and held it steady in both hands until the needle settled. She calculated the distance to the river at the current pace. 20 minutes, maybe less. She turned her horse south and rode hard for the forward signal point. The forward signal point was a low ridge overlooking the snow corridor, and from there, on a clear day, you could see both the river to the north and the entrance to Cottonwood Hollow to the southwest. This was not a clear day. Tamsin reached the ridge and pulled up hard. In the white, she could see maybe 40 yards in any direction. But she could hear the herd, the low, collective sound of more than 1,000 animals moving. The ground vibrating faintly through her horse's legs. She watched the snow patterns. Wind direction showed in the way. Snow moved across flat ground, streaming east to west at the surface, which meant the drift corridor would push the lead animals northeast, if nothing redirected them. She looked at the ridge line to her left, a natural curve in the terrain, barely visible. If the lead cattle hit that curve at an angle instead of straight on, they'd deflect southwest, toward the hollow. But only if something gave them a reason to choose southwest over the open ground ahead. She did the calculation fast. The feed sleds needed to move south and west immediately, ahead of the herd. The scent of hay, in the right direction, was more persuasive than a line of riders. Cattle didn't think their way through a storm, they followed their nose, and the animals in front of them. Get the first 70 to 100, cattle turning southwest inside the ridge, and the rest would follow. It wasn't about controlling 1,000 animals. It was about controlling 20 feet of space at the right moment. She gave the orders through Fenn, who relayed them by rifle shot to the bell station. Cora changed the church bell pattern. 2 slow, 1 fast. That meant advance southwest. The lantern sleds moved. Draft teams pushed them south and west through the snow, creating a broad arc of light, visible even in the whiteout if you were close enough to the ground. Jonah heard the bell change and moved the western horses forward along the herd's left edge, not pushing just presence, the trained animals steady in the noise, where untrained ones would bolt. The cattle on the western edge shifted slightly right, away from the horses. Amos closed the eastern line, and then Tamsin heard it. From the north, at the river gate, metal on metal, a chain being cut. She rode north along the ridge. Vane was at the gate with 2 riders. He had a heavy chain cutter, and he'd already worked through the first of the 3 links, holding the river gate closed. If that gate opened, there was nothing between the lead cattle and Gray Fork. Amos was there first, riding hard out of the white, Jonah a length behind him. They came in from opposite sides, and Vane's two riders pulled up short, caught between them. Russell Dane arrived from the east, which meant he'd followed the sound of the chain cutters through the storm. He'd heard everything from 20 yards out. Bram came through the gate from the north side, on foot, which meant he'd come across the river, ice, to get there faster. Vane looked at him. He still had the chain cutter in his hands. "Step back from the gate," Bram said. Vane looked around at the riders, at Russell, at the storm. He smiled, which was the most dangerous thing he could have done, because it meant he still believed he was managing the situation. "The basin needs to be consolidated," Vane said. "These small operations can't sustain themselves through the kind of winters that are coming. You know that. I'm removing what can't survive. By killing their cattle," Bram said. "By accelerating an outcome that would have arrived anyway. You suppressed the warning that killed Tobin," Bram said. "You let me carry that for 8 years because it was useful to you." His voice was steady. "Step back from the gate." Vane swung the chain cutter. Bram caught his arm and they went down together in the snow. Russell was moving before they hit the ground. He had Vane's coat by the time Bram rolled clear, and the chain cutter went into the snow 3 feet away. One of Vane's riders reached for his gun and found Amos's rifle already leveled at him. He put his hands up. The second rider did the same before being asked. Russell put Vane on his feet and held his arm. "Hollis Vane," he said, "I'm placing you under arrest." Vane looked at the gate, at the cattle moving in the distance through the white. Then the ice under his boots made a sound. He'd stepped back onto the river's surface without realizing it. The thaw had weakened the center channel beneath fresh snow, and the surface had looked solid. It wasn't. The ice gave way in a 4-foot circle, and Vane went through. Bram grabbed the nearest thing, a coiled rope on Amos's saddle, and threw one end toward the hole. Vane got it on the second try. Bram braced and pulled, and Amos grabbed the rope behind him, and they dragged Vane out of the Gray Fork in 30 seconds. Vane lay in the snow, soaked, gasping. Bram stood over him. He could have walked away. He could have called justice and turned his back. He crouched down and made sure Vane was breathing. Then he stood and handed the rope back to Amos. Russell wrapped Vane in a saddle blanket and secured him to a horse. The 2 Iron Crown riders were tied together and led south. Tamsin had seen none of it. She was still on the ridge. The first attempt to turn the herd had partially worked the lantern sleds, and the western horses had moved the lead animals southwest, but the bell pattern had continued 2 beats too long, and the cattle had started resisting the noise. When animals were frightened, sustained sound pushed them away rather than guiding them. They were beginning to drift back east. She made a decision. "Stop the bells," she said to Fenn. Complete silence. Fenn stared at her. "The whole network?" "Everything now." The bells stopped. The rifle shots stopped. The moving lanterns kept going, but silently. In the absence of noise, the scent from the feed sleds reached the lead cattle. Hay, grain, familiar warmth. The lead animals slowed. Their heads came up and turned southwest. Tamsin waited. She counted 15 seconds, which felt much. The first cow moved southwest, then another. Then the group behind them pressed forward and found the same scent and followed. She raised her arm toward Jonah's position. Jonah released the trained horses along the western edge. She lowered her arm toward Amos's signal rider. The eastern line closed in one careful movement. The lead cattle hit the ridge curve and deflected southwest, exactly as the terrain was designed to make them do. The animals behind followed because that was what animals did. They followed the ones ahead when the ones ahead seemed to know where they were going. The first 100 cattle entered the western corridor to Cottonwood Hollow. The next 200 followed. Tamsin rode down from the ridge and positioned herself at the corridor entrance, watching each group pass. She counted by color and brand, marking her map in the dim lantern light. Mercy was behind her, pulling 2 injured riders away from the edge of the movement where they'd been knocked by the outer cattle. Fewer than 30 animals reached the river edge. Most were turned by Amos's riders before they hit the ice. 3 went through in shallow water and were pulled out. Tamsin recorded the losses and kept counting. By the time the last group entered Cottonwood Hollow and the rear riders closed the passage, the storm had reached full intensity. She sat on her horse at the hollow entrance and listened to the herd settle inside. The sound changed from frightened movement to the low, steady noise of animals standing together in shelter. That sound meant they were alive. Bram rode up beside her. He was wet from the river and his coat was frozen at the hem, but he was moving fine. They sat there for a moment without speaking. Then he said, "Ash Creek still needs a winter manager." She looked at him. The snow was coming down hard between them. "Winter is nearly finished," she said. He said, "I wasn't asking you to stay as my manager." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she turned her horse toward the hollow entrance to finish the count, but she was smiling. He saw it before she turned away. April came slowly to Drywater Basin. The snow didn't vanish, it retreated, grudgingly, leaving behind brown grass and muddy ground and fence lines that needed restringing. The creek ran fast and cold with snowmelt. The cottonwood along the banks showed the first pale green of new leaves. Tamsin counted the cattle on the first morning they could open Cottonwood Hollow's western gate. She'd gone in with the final tally before the storm, and she compared it now. The losses were real. Every participating ranch had lost some animals to cold, to injury, to the chaos of the final night. But every ranch had retained enough breeding stock to recover. Not thrive immediately, not recoup a full year's income by summer, but survive, build, continue. No one was selling to Iron Crown in the spring. Russell had transferred Vane to territorial custody within 2 days of the storm. The process after that was methodical. Investigators came up from Laramie and found the Juniper Breaks barns exactly where Lyle had said. They were 3 structures full of hay and grain, purchased under a second company name, stored while the basin's commercial supply was being restricted. They found the depot scales altered by exactly the margin that explained Ash Creek's short bales. They found the investment letters confirming Vane's arrangements with Eastern buyers, timed to coincide with expected spring distressed sales. Amos and Jonah gave statements about the chain cutting at the river gate. Russell gave his own account of what he'd heard directly. The 2 Iron Crown riders offered consideration for their testimony, confirmed Vane's orders regarding the gate and the signal stations. Lyle gave a full written statement from his boarding house bed, witnessed by Cora and Russell both. The feed planted at Ash Creek carried Iron Crown's private tally mark. A depot employee confirmed that Vane had requested access to the emergency stores 3 days before Bram's arrest. Vane pleaded guilty to livestock sabotage and conspiracy, rather than face the full evidence at trial. A separate territorial inquiry addressed the suppressed warning connected to Tobin's death. A telegram confirming both judgments arrived at Bitter Creek on a Thursday morning in late March, before the last of the river ice had finished breaking. Bram read the telegram at the kitchen table. He sat with it for a while. Then he went out to the barn and worked for an hour without talking to anyone, which Tamsin understood was his way of absorbing something that had been a long time arriving. She left him to it. A territorial receiver took control of Iron Crown. The hidden feed was sold and the proceeds distributed to the damaged ranches based on documented losses. Iron Crown's cattle were placed under professional management, and the riders who'd had no part in Vane's plans were allowed to keep their positions. Bram's military contract was reinstated with a formal apology from the Laramie office. The cooperative purchased several of the horses Bram had sold during the winter fair price, no charity. And Ash Creek began rebuilding its breeding program with animals it knew and animals it could train. Ash Creek's first spring foal arrived on a Tuesday, which Pete declared a good omen. The foal was a dark bay filly with a white star, and she followed her mother around the corral with the unsteady confidence of something new to the world. Lyle Creed was not treated as innocent. He'd removed the markers and stolen the journal page, and he'd done both knowingly, whatever pressure he'd been under. He wasn't prosecuted for the fire he hadn't started, but he was held accountable for what he had done. He spent the spring repairing every signal station on the cooperative's winter route and paying back part of the cost of the stolen hay from his own wages. He did this without complaint, which was as close to dignity as the situation allowed. Mercy got her building. The ranchers pooled labor and timber and built her a permanent livestock treatment station at the south end of Bitter Creek, with a stove and a proper instrument cabinet and enough room to work on 2 large animals at once. She moved in before the mud had dried and was treating her first patient the same afternoon. Jonah received a formal partnership contract for winter horses and trail guidance, signed, witnessed, and filed with the Territorial Land Office. He read it twice before he signed it, which was exactly right. Cora became the formal coordinator of the cooperative's Family Shelter Network, with a seat on the oversight board and a vote in the membership decisions. She accepted this without ceremony and immediately began planning the supply inventory for the following winter. Amos called a gathering at the auction yard in late April. He didn't announce it formally. He just sent word that he wanted the cooperative members to come to Bitter Creek on a Saturday and have a meal together. It was the same yard where the cattle auction had been held in October. The same hitching posts, the same fence rails, the same view of the northern ridge. The ranchers gathered in the pale spring light, their wives and hired hands with them. Someone had brought a roasted side of beef. Cora had organized bread and preserved goods from the winter stores. Children ran between the adults' legs. Amos stood up without being asked, which was its own kind of change. He looked across the surviving cattle in the near pasture. He looked at Tamsin, who was standing near the fence with her journal under her arm and her scarlet scarf at her neck. "We said she'd break before winter," he said. He paused long enough for that to sit in the air. Instead, winter broke against everything she taught us to build, Cora said, from somewhere in the middle of the crowd. "Our ranches survived because she taught us to stop standing alone." Nobody argued with that. The Drywater Weather and Stock Cooperative held its first formal meeting 2 weeks later. Membership required shared winter labor and transparent supply records. No exceptions, no private stockpiling, no information withheld that could affect another member's survival. Women, hired workers, and smaller operators all had voting representation. Tamsin had made that a condition before she agreed to direct the organization. The Territorial Weather Office signed a formal reporting agreement with her station. It was the kind of document that meant her observations would be taken seriously, forwarded properly, and credited to the correct name. The observation room was named the Alaric Wren Weather Room, a small brass plate beside the door. His name in clear letters. A public statement from the Territorial Inquiry cleared him of professional wrongdoing. Tobin Calder's name was added to a memorial for the riders killed after the suppressed warning. Tamsin stood in front of that memorial for a while on the afternoon it was installed. She didn't cry. She thought about her father in the way she was learning to think about him, not as someone she'd failed to save, but as someone whose work had mattered enough that a man with real power had spent years trying to erase it. That told her something about the work. Bram stood beside her. He didn't put his arm around her or try to manage what she was feeling. He just stood there, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, looking at the same memorial she was looking at. After a while, he said, he was right. She nodded. They rode back to Ash Creek along the old winter route. The scarlet ribbons were still tied to most of the fence posts. Faded from months of weather, the red turned soft and pale, but still there, still visible above the new grass. At the highest ridge, one ribbon had worked loose from its post and was hanging by a single knot. Tamsin stopped and retied it. Bram dismounted beside her and reset the post, which had heaved in the freeze-thaw cycle and was leaning 4 inches off true. He didn't take the ribbon from her hands. He worked on his part and let her work on hers. Below them, cattle moved through the basin in the afternoon light. She looked at the ranch in the distance, at the frame of the new weather room rising beside the house, the timber, pale and fresh against the old wood of the barn. She looked at Bram. At Ash Creek, he'd asked her to stay, not as his manager, not as something that belonged to him or owed him anything. As his equal, in the ranch and in life. She'd thought about it for a week before she answered. The answer was yes. Not because winter had trapped her there, not because she had nowhere else to go. She had Cheyenne, she had the territorial office, she had options she'd worked years to earn. She stayed because she chose to, because Ash Creek was a place where her name was on the weather room door, and her instruments were on the shelf, and her voice carried the same weight as anyone else's at the table, because Bram Calder had stood in a blizzard and accepted her command in front of every rancher in the basin, and meant it, because staying this time was not what winter forced on her. It was the future she freely chose. She mounted and rode down the ridge toward home. The first spring foal was visible from the gate, still unsteady, still learning the ground, following its mother into the sunlight as if the whole world were simply waiting to be known. They said she'd break before winter. She didn't, and neither did the basin. But here's what I want you to sit with. Because this story isn't really about Wyoming in 1886. It isn't about cattle, or storms, or one woman proving a yard full of doubting men wrong. Those things are all in there, but they're the surface. What's underneath is something that hasn't changed in 140 years. Tamsin Wren arrived in Bitter Creek with almost nothing. No money, no title, no institution behind her name. What she had was knowledge, preparation, and the willingness to say a hard truth out loud in a room full of people who didn't want to hear it. That's not a comfortable position to stand in. Most people, when they feel that kind of resistance, go quiet. They soften the warning. They wait for a better moment. Tamsin didn't. She said what the barometer told her. She said it clearly, and she stood there while they laughed. That takes a specific kind of courage that has nothing to do with being fearless. It has everything to do with deciding that the truth matters more than your comfort in the next 5 minutes. And then there's Bram, a man who built his entire life around one decision he believed had killed his brother. He'd made himself small on purpose, a small ranch, a small circle, small responsibilities, because he thought that keeping his world contained was the same thing as keeping people safe. It wasn't. Silence isn't protection. Withholding the truth to spare someone pain is still a choice, and it still has consequences. Bram had to learn that the hard way, and a lot of us do. We think we're protecting people when we're really just protecting ourselves from the discomfort of honesty. What saved Drywater Basin wasn't a single heroic act. It wasn't one person riding in with the right answer at the last moment. It was a network. Scarlet ribbons on fence posts, bell codes between ranches. A boarding house owner who knew which families needed warming stations. A veterinarian who showed up with her sleeves already rolled. A tracker who knew which valleys stayed open in deep snow. A skeptic who finally put his pride down long enough to say, "All right, tell me what needs to happen." The whole thing worked because people who had spent years competing against each other decided, in the worst winter of their lives, to share what they had instead. That's the real lesson here. Preparation is not pessimism. When Tamsin read the pressure drop and told the ranchers winter was coming hard, she wasn't trying to frighten them. She was trying to give them time. There's a version of that conversation happening somewhere in your life. Right now, someone warning you about something. Something you'd rather not deal with. Something that requires effort and change and cooperation with people who might not be easy to work with. The question is whether you're going to be Amos Pike in Chapter 1 or Amos Pike in Chapter 10. He got there eventually, It just cost him more than it had to. Strength in this story is never one person standing alone. It's never the loudest voice or the largest operation or the man with the most to lose who ends up saving the basin. It's the woman who stayed when she could have left. The man who accepted someone else's command in front of everyone and meant it. The community that built something together that none of them could have built alone and made it strong enough to survive not just one winter, but the winters that come after. So if this story leaves you with anything, let it be this. Warn people when you see the storm coming, even if they laugh. Build the network before you need it, not after. Share what you have. Trust carefully, but actually trust, don't just perform it. And when someone stands beside you, in the hard work without trying to take it from you, that's worth something. Don't be slow to recognize it. Winter always comes. What you build before it arrives is everything. This story is a work of fiction. All characters, ranches, locations, events, and organizations are entirely imaginary, and any resemblance to real persons or places is coincidental. The historical setting is used for narrative purposes only and does not claim to represent specific documented events.